David, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Hey, thank you so much.
Let's begin by talking about just how does Unilever engage, to what extent, with the agroeconomy in this region?
Yeah, well, look, firstly, it's a very important part of our business. Our products are related to about roughly 3 million hectares of agricultural need. We're a very big player in palm, both for our home care and our personal care business, and a little bit for our foods business. In this region particularly, we're heavily invested in coconut sugar, wonderful business in Indonesia, and coconut oil in the Philippines generally. So it's a very important part of our business, important part of the supply chain we run. Engaging with large players is important, and equally engaging with smallholders directly is a fundamental part of our strategy going forward.
To what extent? I mean, a global company like yours presumably doesn't get right down to the smallholder level, or do you? To what extent?
Yeah, no, you have to, because they are such a large part of the sourcing in this region. And they're such a large part of the integrity of the sourcing in this region. So, we work directly with a large part of the smallholder network, particularly Indonesia, obviously, and Malaysia. We feel that they are the ultimate stewards of the land. And, when we look at what our consumers are increasingly asking for, they want to know, where was it sourced, which farmer, which field, what impact has that had on the landscape, if any, and sometimes even what's the financial impact, the financial flow through.
What have you found? What are the common themes that you're hearing from these farmers? What are the challenges and the opportunities that you as Unilever see in those engagements?
Well, I think fundamentally you see that it's a tough life for a smallholder. They're absolutely at the behest of commodity pricing, weather systems. In the last 2 years, we've seen the dramatic effects of COVID affecting labour forces coming into this region and being able to grow things like palm or yield things like palm. So you start to understand the difficulties, the ups and downs of a smallholder's life are very dramatic. That if you were just operating 6 steps down, you see a far smoother connection with your direct suppliers. So it's been good to understand that, good to understand the opportunities within that. So we know that smallholders operate, roughly speaking, at half the yield of crop than large-scale professional systems of companies, larger-scale companies. So there's an opportunity, because if we can work and help educate the smallholder, we can avoid them using more land for the same crop. We get better yields for them. They get better income.
But let's pick that apart for a second. So you're saying that their yield is smaller because of a lack of education, and they compensate for the smaller yield by growing their actual geographical footprint rather than increasing their productivity.
Yeah. I mean, depending on whichever crop it is, but it can be a mixture of they don't have money for fertilizer at a given time of the year. They don't have money for the right irrigation of a particular crop. They don't have the training and education to know exactly how to optimize yield within a crop. And therefore, there's opportunity in helping them change that for themselves.
Unlocking the potential that exists for increasing their yield. How do we do that? I mean, you've named a couple of elements that are key to that happening, but in practical terms, how does one actually implement the solution?
Yeah. Well, I'll come back. Firstly, it's fundamentally important that companies like us understand that source. So without being able to identify that source, you can't include that farmer in your thinking. So firstly, understand the source, include the farmer into the system, and then help them through educational mechanisms. We've had real examples in the last 4 or 5 years working in the Enhancing Livelihood Fund. We've worked with partnerships on where ourselves and our partner companies are going to educate the farmer in terms of best fertilizer, best timing, best way to irrigate, best way to harvest that optimize their yields. We've done that on a number of our crops. We've had a lead partner in IDH working with us across the world, in fact, very successfully. And we see them and that system as a strategic driver of our including but getting better yield, getting more security of supply without increasing the hectarage and the area that's used for farming.
Is that an approach that will scale? One of the problems that we have, and consistently over the years, the decades, is that we can identify individual problems, we can propose individual solutions, but scaling it, unlocking the potential across a large area is the trouble. I mean, how do you see that fitting in?
Look, the opportunity is there. A third of all palm is handled by smallholders. So it's a fundamentally large part of the volume that we want to access. We want to improve their yield so that we can get more volume from the same hectarage. It gives us direct knowledge of whether people are getting the right income for that, and the core of our sourcing has integrity with respect to deforestation control, particularly if I'm talking in the palm sector.
You mentioned finance, and that's from the smallholder side. That's one thing that you hear a lot of, is they're unable to access reliable, secure, and consistent financing. Yeah. What part do you play in that? Can you play in that? Is it a major element of the engagement that you have?
Yeah, well, a large part of the engagement we have is where we're financing things directly, ensuring that that's sustainable and for the long-term value. So if you've got a farmer that's producing at half the yield that he should be producing, what we want to do is, but they don't have money to go on an education program to understand the difference, or they're not having access to fertilizer at the right cost. That's where we see the opportunity of financing, helping that farmer. So for us, it has to be, in that sense, sustainable, so that we know that the farmer can improve their operation and improve their yield to the point that his income is improving and he's self-sustaining a better income through the education we've given him. And we finance the education, or we finance the fertilizer costs, or in some way help that process. But that's where I think financing can help, and it can help at scale. It's not just a highly targeted approach. It can help with scale.
In this growing awareness and acceptance and pursuit of ESG goals and ethics, if you like, are you seeing within Unilever, and indeed companies like Unilever, a greater tendency towards collaborating with, I guess, competitors even, to a large extent? Or are you still trying to address some of these problems specifically through a Unilever lens?
Yeah, no, spot on. I think we're seeing every form of ecosystem of partnership. So that can be us and peers. And if you take responsible sourcing of palm oil or soy oil in Latin America, we're doing that with peers across industry in improving the generic base of supply and ensuring that that's, we're raising the floor of that and the ceiling of those industries. It's working with companies I mentioned before, and communities and governments to try and help land right usage, so there's clarity upon land rights for farmers. We're also working with ecosystems of technology suppliers. Orbital Insight, Google, we're working with their Earth Engine to track and trace and our supply, and effectively have a digital copy of the land that we'll be tracking and tracing. I can see that technology is going to disrupt, and in a positive way, the integrity of sourcing across this full network. the ability for technology to track and trace at scale instantaneously is phenomenal. It's been one of the largest joys of my job in the last 3 years of seeing how technology can make a difference in mapping the earth, mapping the ecosystems of the earth, overlaying that, the mapping supply chains that are moving across those ecosystems.
So give me a specific example. I mean, what are you engaging with?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier we're doing work with Google and with Orbital Insight. With Google within their Earth Engine, we're taking forest data, a biodiversity data. We're overlaying that data with supply chain data. So we're tracking mobile phone cell pings that are operating in and around fields and mills. So we start to get an assessment of risk of where's there been movement from a deforested piece of land into a mill that we're operating with. And we start to instantaneously get risk statements of something's moved from that field, which we know is deforested, into a mill that we're operating with. That's a risk for us that we wouldn't have no visibility of before. So that technology is allowing us to map our full soy chain in Latin America and our full palm chain in this region within the space of months. And you start to get a very detailed insight as to your supply chain that you're operating, which you would never have seen before. And it's part of an ecosystem of understanding your supply chain. It's not the full thing, but it's part of an equation of, well, the data is telling us this, our relationship with the farmers is telling us that, our people on the ground are telling us something, and we piece this together in terms of, is our supply chain the highest integrity that we demand?
Are there technologies that you're seeing out there at ground level that are really exciting and really transformative? Stuff that you can put into the hands of the farmers themselves or the groups within that ecosystem to make things easier?
There is. In different crops, we're seeing this around the world of great technology from any number of companies in terms of weather systems, water systems, soil health technology that then can feed into specifically what fertilizer and where it should be applied. So the technology for farmers has developed incredibly over the last 5 years. Particularly, it gives them much more insight into, rather than blanket farming and blanket fertilizing, they can be much more fine-tuned about where do they put irrigation systems or fertilizer systems.
I'm just wondering if there is a shift in sensibility, a shift in the way that these things are now being considered compared to even 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think so. I speak to many CPOs in different industries and in our own sector directly. And in this space of sustainability, there's much more openness, I think, than 5 years ago that we should be doing things together. It makes sense that if we're working with farmers in Medan and another company is working with farmers just next door, that we leverage resources and tools and techniques to improve a wider community, a wider part.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, this may be a little speculative, but I just wonder where that might go. You were, one of the major players originally with RSPO. The evolution of that organization and those interactions. Can you talk me through that a little bit? I mean, do you think that we're evolving into a different way of approaching these things? And how can we scale that particular approach and amplify that particular activity?
So yeah, look, the RSPO has been this fantastic vehicle of including a very wide range of buyer peer companies and supplier peer companies and improving the floor of how we operate within the palm industry, ensuring inclusion of farmers, well-being of farmers, well-being of the land and nature that we're operating within has been fundamental. We see the same in soy. We work very closely in partnerships in tea. And those have been very influential in changing industries over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And I think they'll continue to evolve.
What about governments? Let's bring in that aspect of the whole thing, because none of this regional activity can occur without governments of individual nations and governments between nations being able to coordinate and collaborate on these things. What role can a government play to make life easier for the work that you're trying to do, the stuff that you've been talking about?
Yeah, we're working very closely with the ecosystems between ourselves, peer companies, companies like NGOs, and with governments. And governments are helping enormously in terms of facilitation of data, giving, where relevant, land data, land ownership data that is fundamental to you, then overlaying that with forest data, and so you know who's farming which piece of land around the world. So a lot of that they're starting to work with us on. It's not everywhere to the level that we'd want it to be, but I think that
is one of the sticking points, it seems.
It's one of the sticking points in some areas around the world where we're getting that clarity of data isn't as good as it should be, but there's many that are starting to move. If
there was a particular element of government relations that you think needs addressing most urgently, what would it be?
One of the things that's particularly at the moment, and this is less about the link between climate and nature. So we're all understanding that the link between climate, nature, and social is much more interconnected than we first thought. You know, we thought there was a climate agenda, a land development and protection and regeneration agenda, and a social agenda. They're actually all interconnected. One of the challenges is the financing flows between these. So what you're seeing in the world right now is huge money going into climate funds. Availability of huge funds going into climate funds. A development of carbon credits around the world. Now the linkaging between the fund, where the money is, the credit, which is associated with the nature and the land in a particular country, and money going to actual farmers in a country, that needs governmental support for that equation to work properly. So we would like to see more integration of the financing between the availability of funds, the credits going to nature in farming, the link of doing better farming being good for climate, and the inclusion of the social agenda in that. The smallholders who are seeing most of the turbulence, get some of the poorest in the world, are looking after that nature. And the money is flowing across that equation in a more equitable, circular, if I use that term, way than it is today. And that can only happen if governments are integrating, aligning their systems better than they are today.
Are you sensing that they are getting that message? Are you sensing that there is a momentum behind the intent, or is there more? Are you hoping to see more?
I'm hoping to see much more. I think they're starting to sense it. I'm hoping to see more because we won't solve the climate agenda without getting the nature agenda much more developed. We won't solve the nature agenda without the credit agenda working well for nature and for farming. And we won't solve farming unless we include smallholders into that equation, and they see benefit from being a smallholder farmer by getting financial flow to them.
What do you think is holding it up then?
I think it's a complex thing where you've got international funds of money and potential international credit systems versus localized governmental systems. So how do you connect an international green credit scheme globally with any country in this region particularly, or in Latin America or in Africa, where they're getting the value of the credit from their land, not some international system. So how do we connect the cost and value of that credit to the local country and to the smallholder?
Which brings us back to the finance question. And you know, one of the underpinning elements of this whole series of conversations is exactly that, is there a way in which we can solve this particular disparity, if we can? Because the finance mechanisms tend to look at these opportunities, if you like, in a very distinctive perspective, which doesn't always match the reality of the smallholder farmer and his or her realities. And aligning those agendas is something that's been difficult all along. I mean,
I think it has. It's not difficult right now. You see huge funds in the world, green funds looking to invest in green development, so-called green development. The difficulty is not raising the money. The difficulty is finding the projects that add value with integrity.
That is what the financiers always say. But is that necessarily a problem on the side of the farmers, or is that because the financiers themselves need to readjust what their criteria are for evaluating a potential investment?
I think there's a scientific lock in the middle of this. So the scientific lock is you can't credit management. Finance goes to farming through a credit system. Credit systems require integrity, and the integrity in this space is the science of what does regenerative farming, better sustainable farming bring to actual carbon impact. Now, when we get the clarity of that, it will help facilitate financial flow into farming.
What do you mean by the clarity of that?
Well, so if you are claiming that you're doing regenerative farming in one crop in 1 year, and the scientific value of that in terms of carbon management is X, how do we know it's the same X in the same crop in a different country, or a different part of the same country, or it's the same carbon impact next year? How do you account for that? Is a real difficulty.
Is there a role you can play in that? All these conversations and interactions and engagements that you have with the smallholder farming community, you know what their problems are and how they need to balance their own practical realities with the more scientific approach that the financiers take. How can you play a middle role in that?
Yeah, I think there is a role for us and other people in terms of there's something between the financiers who are raising the funds and the farmers who are developing agricultural systems, with the scientists who link the two together of what's the carbon benefit of doing something better in farming, and is it the same 1 year to the next year? So how do I have an integrity of a system of carbon credits to farming that says I've improved I've done regenerative farming in soy, and I've intercropped and I've irrigated properly in 2022, and I do the same or slightly different in 2023. Who's accounting for that? That says I've got this amount of carbon this year, benefited what amount next year. The science behind that needs to be more consistent, of a higher credibility, for the funds to properly flow between the funds that are available and the farmers.
See, once again, we're sort of getting into this theoretical realm, discussing the broad ideas of what could be done and what should be done and what are the priorities. One of the problems is that we do tend to spend a lot of time discussing things at this level and not enough time in actually thinking, well, how do we actually make that happen? And how do we make it scale? And how do we do it fast? And this is one of the things that, again, we're trying to address within this. And I don't know whether within the context of the stuff that you do, you can see solutions that are not immediately applicable, but certainly things that you can actually do that will generate action as opposed to generate principle.
Yeah, no, it's a super point. Moving from idea to impact is critical. We've got to stop talking about the idea and the policy and the theory and the future into what's the impact today. We've got I think it's a beautiful project in coconut sugar. Is this a wonderful product that goes into one of our big brands in Indonesia. It's called Bango. It's a table sauce in Indonesia. It sits in almost every consumer's home in Indonesia. It's made from coconut sugar. Coconut sugar to harvest involves going up a tree twice a day. A farmer climbing up a tree and sequestering the fluid from the coconut and then cooking that fluid up. And it then being sent through for us for refining and putting into product. Now, youngsters don't want to be climbing trees. So what we see is fewer and fewer farmers willing to go up these high trees. I tried 3 years ago before COVID. I think I got 2 steps up the tree. I thought, I'm physically not fit to do this, and it was scary. So we've had a 5-year development with innovation from farming institutes on dwarf trees, so that rather than being 30 foot tall, they're 12 foot tall, so that it's easy to walk up and at hand height level, standing on the floor, you can sequester the fluid and harvest the fluid, and therefore get more people back into that crop because it's easy to harvest. So youngsters come back into the crop. But that's a great link, I think, of science and agronomy having a real impact on the availability of the product and getting more farming into that product. And therefore, yield is better as well, by the way. So it's not just easier to harvest, the yield is better from the dwarf trees. So we're deploying those around Indonesia, Myanmar, Thailand at the moment.
Through all the activities that you do, some of which you've touched upon here, do you have suggestions, advice to other companies, perhaps not as big as Unilever, but other companies, about how they can make a difference in their industries and in their bringing together their own communities of farmers and interlinked ecosystem members?
Yeah, there's a few themes, I think, in what I've said, that companies have got to know their sourcing. That may sound simple, but most companies work through other companies, through traders, and don't know the farmer, don't know the actual source. So firstly, you've got to know the actual source and include those farmers in your system. Know them, understand them, know the issues they have, and include them and move into training and development systems with those farmers. Target improvement and measure the improvement that you're aiming for without setting. We set some really hairy goals 12 years ago now in our Sustainable Living Plan that most of us, when we first saw them, in some cases we didn't even understand the metric. And if we did understand the metric, we thought it was just a crazy number to be aiming for. But actually setting hairy goals makes you look in a different way at a problem. It makes you include other people. And that's the last piece of advice there's lots of people around who want to help, whether it's NGOs, partners, peer groups, who want to be helping in this. So it's not something you need to feel you're doing alone as a company. Join with these groups, work with peers. We do it, and we're quite a large company. It's been fundamental to us to be part of these ecosystems, to get scale in our change. So for anybody, that they should be accessing that. So it's know your sourcing, include that sourcing, make sure it's equitable for those people, look at training development, but do that with ecosystems around you.
David, appreciate your time. Thanks for talking to me.
Thank you. Cheers.